I woke with a gasp, my breath ragged, as if I'd just clawed my way out of a nightmare. But as the soft glow of a crystal chandelier above me filtered through my blurred vision, I realized the nightmare wasn't a dream. It was real. I was lying on a bed, the kind of bed you'd see in a luxury magazine, with white silk sheets that felt too smooth against my skin. The sheets had slipped off my shoulder, revealing the oversized white dress shirt I was wearing. It wasn't mine. The faint scent of a man's cologne, sandalwood, and something sharp, like citrus, clung to the fabric, making my heart pound in my chest. I clutched the sheets closer, my fingers trembling, as a wave of panic surged through me. Where was I? My mind raced, grasping for the last memory I could hold on to. James. My brother's voice, shaky and desperate, echoed in my ears. "Just this once, Evelyn," he'd pleaded, his eyes red and swollen, his hands gripping mine so tightly it hurt. "They'll kill me if I don't pay the debt. This man, he'll take care of you." I'd wanted to scream at him, to shove him away, to tell him I wasn't a bargaining chip to be sold off like some object at an auction. But I couldn't. Not when I saw the terror in his eyes, the kind of terror that told me he wasn't lying. Not when I thought of Mom and Emily, my little sister, who'd be left with nothing if James didn't make it out of this alive. I sat up, my gaze darting around the room. It was massive, opulent in a way that felt suffocating. The walls were a pale cream, the furniture dark and sleek, every detail screaming wealth. A large window stretched across one wall, offering a breathtaking view of New York City at night. The Empire State Building stood tall in the distance, its lights piercing the darkness like a beacon, but it brought me no comfort. I didn't belong here. I belonged in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, curled up on my worn-out couch with a cup of tea, not in this gilded cage. The door creaked open and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A man stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe. His dark hair was neatly combed back, but it was his eyes that struck me, sharp, cold, and unreadable. Yet there was something else in them, a flicker of something I couldn't place. He stopped at the threshold, his gaze locking onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt the weight of his stare, heavy and unyielding, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're awake," he said finally, his voice low and steady, devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a question, just a statement, as if he'd been expecting this moment. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to speak, though my voice trembled. "Who are you? Why am I here?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I needed answers. I needed to know why I was in this room, wearing his shirt, with no memory of how I'd gotten here. He stepped closer, his polished shoes silent against the hardwood floor, and placed a glass of water on the bedside table. His movements were deliberate, controlled, but his eyes never left mine. "I'm the man who bought you," he said, his tone as cold as his gaze. "But I'm not the monster you think I am." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Bought me. I wasn't a person to him. I was a transaction, a deal to settle my brother's debts. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms as a surge of anger and humiliation washed over me. "I'm not a thing to be bought," I snapped, my voice breaking, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel the weight of what he'd just said. But all I could do was sit there, trembling, as the reality of my situation sank in. He didn't respond immediately, just watched me, his expression unreadable. But then, for a fleeting moment, I saw it again. That flicker in his eyes, a shadow of something that looked like pain, or maybe regret. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same cold mask he'd worn when he walked in. "I know," he said, his voice softer this time, almost a whisper. "You can rest. I won't do anything to you." I didn't believe him. How could I? He'd just admitted to buying me, to treating me like a commodity. I turned my face away, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over, my chest, tight with a mix of fear and rage. I heard his footsteps as he walked away, the door closing softly behind him. But the sound didn't bring me any relief. If anything, it made the silence feel heavier, more oppressive. I looked out the window again, the city lights twinkling like stars against the night sky. They were beautiful, but they felt so far away, like a world I could never reach. I stood, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and walked to the window. It was locked, the glass too thick to break, but I pressed my hands against it anyway, as if I could somehow push my way out. I needed to escape, to get back to Mom and Emily, to the life I'd known before James had shattered it with his betrayal. The door opened again, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Damian was back, his expression darker now, more intense. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp, almost accusatory. "I want to go home," I shouted, my voice cracking as the tears finally spilled over. I didn't care how desperate I sounded. I just wanted out. He moved quickly, closing the distance between us in a few strides, and grabbed my wrist, pulling me away from the window. "You can't," he said, his tone firm, unyielding. "Not now." I tried to yank my arm free, but his grip was strong, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was something in his gaze, something raw, something broken, that made me pause, even as my heart screamed at me to run. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just afraid of him. I was afraid of what his eyes were making me feel. The days that followed blurred into a haze of silence and solitude, each one stretching out like an eternity in Damian's penthouse. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, polished marble floors, sleek furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of New York City. But to me, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. I felt like a bird with clipped wings, trapped in a world of luxury that I neither wanted nor belonged to. Every morning, I woke up on that same oversized bed, the silk sheets cool against my skin, still wearing Damian's white dress shirt because I had nothing else. My own clothes, my phone, my life. They'd all been stripped away the moment James handed me over to this man. I refused to speak to Damian, refused to look him in the eye. I couldn't bear the thought of acknowledging him, of giving him even a shred of power over me beyond what he'd already taken. He didn't force me to interact, didn't demand anything of me, which somehow made it worse. His silence felt like a weapon, a reminder of how little I mattered in this world he'd dragged me into. Every day, he'd leave a tray of food on, the glass dining table in the living room, a fresh salad with vibrant greens, a slice of toasted sourdough, a glass of orange juice, but I never touched it. I didn't want his charity. I didn't want to owe him anything more than I already did. I spent my days pacing the penthouse, searching for a way out. But the main door was locked with a keypad I didn't have the code for, and the windows were sealed tight. I was a prisoner in every sense of the word, and the weight of that reality pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. To keep myself sane, I clung to the small things that reminded me of home. I called Mom on the landline Damian had left in the living room, my heart lifting at the sound of her voice. Emily got accepted into that art school she applied for, Mom said, her tone a mix of pride and exhaustion. "She's so excited, Evelyn. She can't stop talking about it." I smiled, picturing my little sister's bright eyes and the way she'd always doodle on every scrap of paper she could find. "That's amazing, Mom," I said, my voice cracking slightly. Tell her I'm proud of her. But as I hung up, the smile faded, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. I was happy for Emily, but I couldn't shake the bitterness that gnawed at me. I'd given up everything, my dreams, my freedom, to save James, to keep our family from falling apart. And yet here I was, more alone than I'd ever been. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city lights outside the window cast a soft glow across the ceiling, their flickering patterns a cruel reminder of the world I couldn't reach. I wrapped the old sweater I'd found in a drawer, my father's, one of the few things James hadn't taken from me, around my shoulders and slipped out of the bedroom. The penthouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a wall clock in the hallway. I wandered into the living room, intending to grab a glass of water, when I heard his voice, low, tense, and laced with a raw edge I hadn't heard before. I told you, I won't let what happened to Clara happen again. Never. Damian's words came from the direction of the study, sharp and clipped, as if he were speaking through gritted teeth. I froze, my heart pounding, and pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more. Clara. The name sent a shiver down my spine, though I didn't know why. Who was she? And why did Damian sound so broken when he said her name? I waited, holding my breath, but he didn't say anything else. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with questions I didn't have the courage to ask. I crept back to my room, my mind racing. Clara. The name echoed in my thoughts, a puzzle piece I couldn't fit into the fragmented picture of Damian's life. I wanted to know more, but I didn't dare confront him. Not yet. Instead, I tried to do something small, something that might break through the wall of silence between us. The next morning, I brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, and poured a cup for Damian. I left it on the dining table with a note that simply read, "For you." It was a gesture, a tiny olive branch, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. When I woke up the next day, the cup was still there, untouched, the coffee cold and the note unopened. A sharp pang of rejection stabbed at my chest, and I felt a fool for even trying. I wasn't a guest here, wasn't a partner or a friend. I was a transaction, a means to an end. Damian didn't care about me, didn't see me as anything more than a debt paid. The realization made me feel invisible, insignificant, like a ghost haunting this pristine penthouse. I sank onto the couch, pulling Dad's sweater tighter around me, and stared out at the city skyline. The Empire State Building glowed in the distance, a symbol of dreams and possibilities. But to me, it was a cruel taunt. I was trapped, not just by the locked doors and sealed windows, but by the weight of my own choices. I'd sacrificed everything for my family, but at what cost? And who was this man who'd bought me, who carried a name like Clara in his voice with such pain? I didn't know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I wanted to survive this, I'd have to find out, no matter how much it scared me. The penthouse had become my prison. But Damian decided it was time for me to step out into his world, a world of glittering lights, sharp smiles, and whispered judgments. He announced it one morning, his voice as cold and detached as ever. "There's an event tonight. You'll come with me." It wasn't a request, and I didn't have the energy to argue. I'd spent days avoiding him, clinging to my silence like a shield, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. So I nodded, my stomach twisting with dread, and spent the day preparing for a night I wanted no part of. The gown Damian had left for me was stunning, a deep emerald green that shimmered under the light, with a neckline that dipped just low, enough to make me feel exposed. I slipped it on, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the fabric, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, a polished doll dressed up for someone else's game. I missed my old jeans, my faded sweaters, the comfort of being invisible, but there was no going back now. The event was held in a grand ballroom in Manhattan, the kind of place where chandeliers sparkled like stars and champagne flowed like water. I clung to Damian's arm as we entered, his presence a cold anchor in a sea of unfamiliar faces. The room buzzed with the hum of conversation, but I felt the weight of every gaze that turned our way. Whispers followed us like shadows. Who is she? The girl he bought to pay off a debt? A nobody in a borrowed dress. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I kept my head high, refusing to let them see how much their words cut. Damian was a statue beside me, his face a mask of indifference. He didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me, but I noticed the way he moved, always positioning himself slightly in front of me, a subtle barrier between me and the crowd. When a particularly bold reporter shoved a microphone in my face, asking, "How does it feel to be the millionaire's latest acquisition?" Damian's hand shot out, pushing the microphone away. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous, his fingers tightening briefly on my arm. I glanced at him, startled by the protective edge in his tone, but his expression remained unreadable, his jaw clenched tight. For a moment, I wondered if there was more to him than the cold, calculating man I'd assumed him to be. But before I could dwell on it, a new presence cut through the crowd. A woman, tall and striking, with auburn hair cascading over her shoulders and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She approached us with the confidence of someone who belonged here, her crimson dress hugging her curves like a second skin. "Damian," she purred, her voice dripping with familiarity. "It's been too long." Damian's body stiffened beside me, his grip on my arm tightening for a fraction of a second before he released me. "Clara," he said, his tone flat, but I caught the undercurrent of tension in his voice. Clara. The name I'd heard him speak that night in the Penthouse, the name that had carried so much pain. My heart raced as I studied her, trying to piece together the puzzle of their history. Clara's gaze shifted to me, her smile sharpening into something predatory. "And this must be the new girl," she said, her eyes raking over me with a mix of amusement and disdain. "I'm Clara, Damian's... well, let's just say I was once where you are now." Her words were a knife, twisting in my gut, and I felt the air leave my lungs. What did she mean? Had Damian bought her too? Or was there something deeper, something more personal between them? I forced myself to speak, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not your pawn," I said, meeting her gaze head-on. I wouldn't let her intimidate me, no matter how much her presence unnerved me. Clara's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, calculating edge. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." She turned back to Damian, her tone shifting to something softer, more intimate. "You can't keep running from the past, Damian," she said, her hand brushing his arm in a way that made my stomach churn. "You owe me more than you'll ever admit." Damian didn't respond, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tick, his eyes darkening with something I couldn't name. Anger. Guilt, maybe both. Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. "Damian doesn't love anyone," she said, her breath warm against my ear. "Don't fool yourself into thinking you're different." Then she pulled back, her smile as sharp as a blade, and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble. Floor like a countdown to something I couldn't yet see. I stood there, my heart pounding, my mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was Clara to Damian? Why did she hate him so much? And why did she seem to hate me even more? I glanced at Damian, searching for answers in his expression, but he was already turning away, his face a mask of stone. "Let's go," he said, His voice clipped, and I followed him, my thoughts spiraling. As we stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights glittering around us, I realized something chilling. Clara wasn't just a ghost from Damian's past. She was a threat, one that wanted to destroy not just him, but me too. And if I was going to survive this world I'd been thrown into, I needed to understand her, and the man who'd brought me here, before it was too late. The city lights blurred past us as Damian and I walked down a quiet street. The cool night air a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the gala we'd just left. I'd insisted on walking instead of taking the car, needing the space to breathe, to think, to process the venom in Clara's words. Damian doesn't love anyone. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're different. Her voice echoed. In my mind, each syllable a dagger that twisted deeper with every step. I glanced at Damian beside me, his face still a mask of stone, his hands buried in the pockets of his suit jacket. He hadn't said a word since we left the ballroom, and the silence between us felt heavier than ever. I wanted to ask him about Clara, to demand the truth about their past, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I kept my eyes on the pavement, watching the way the streetlights cast long shadows that danced across the concrete. The city was alive around us, cars honking in the distance, the faint hum of laughter from a nearby bar. But I felt like I was in a bubble, isolated from it. That bubble shattered when a flash of light blinded me, followed by the unmistakable click of a camera shutter. "Damian! Over here!" a voice shouted, and I turned to see a swarm of paparazzi closing in, their cameras flashing like a storm of lightning. Who's the new girl? Another fling? Or something more transactional? The questions came fast, each one a barb that pierced my already fragile defenses. My cheeks burned with humiliation, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart racing. I wasn't prepared for this, the scrutiny, the judgment, the way they stripped me bare with their lenses and their words. Damian's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist and pulling me behind him. "Get back!" he growled at the photographers, his voice low and dangerous, his body a shield between me and the chaos. The cameras kept flashing, but he didn't flinch, his grip on me firm but not painful. For a moment, I felt a flicker of safety, a strange warmth in the shadow of his protection, but it was quickly drowned out by the weight of the headlines I knew would follow. Millionaire's mystery woman. Bought and paid for? I could already see the words splashed across tabloids, each one a reminder of the deal that had brought me here. When the paparazzi finally dispersed, driven off by Damian's icy glare and a few choice words, he released my wrist and turned to me. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "We should go," he said, his voice clipped, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The pressure of the night, the weight of Clara's warning, the sting of the cameras, it was all too much, and something inside me snapped. "Why don't you ever tell me the truth?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. I stepped closer, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my eyes searching his for something, anything, that would make sense of this nightmare I'd been thrown into. Who is Clara? What does she want? And why am I really here, Damian? Because I'm starting to think there's more to this deal than you're letting on. For a moment, he just stared at me, his gaze piercing, as if he could see straight through, to the raw, aching parts of me I'd tried so hard to hide. Then, to my surprise, he sighed, a heavy, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. "You want the truth?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "Fine, but you might not like what you hear." Turned away, his shoulders tense, and for a moment, I thought he'd walk away, leaving me with nothing but more questions. But then he spoke, his words low and measured, each one a revelation that hit me like a tidal wave. "I have a son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan. He's 8 years old. I've never claimed him, never been a father to him because I thought it would ruin everything I'd built. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what he'd just said. A son. Damian had a child he'd kept hidden, a child he'd abandoned for the sake of his empire. The weight of his confession settled over me, heavy and suffocating, and I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't untangle. Shock, anger, and something else. Something softer. Like pity. Clara, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. She's his mother. She left me when she was pregnant and I let her go. I chose my career over them, over her, over him. It's the biggest regret of my life. I stared at him, my heart pounding, as the pieces began to fall into place. Clara's bitterness, her venom, it wasn't just about Damian abandoning her. It was about their son, about the life he'd denied them both. And now I was caught in the middle of their fractured history, a pawn in a game I hadn't even known. I was playing. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice trembling, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. Why drag me into this mess? Damian turned back to me, his eyes raw with a pain I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made him seem almost human. Because I didn't want you to get hurt by my past, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch me, but he stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist. I thought I could keep you separate from it, but I was wrong. I took a step back, my mind reeling, my heart torn between the anger I felt at being used and the empathy I couldn't help but feel for the man standing before me. I don't know if I can stay here, I whispered, my voice breaking, and for the first time, I saw something like fear flash across Damian's face. Under the streetlights, with the city humming around us, I realized that the truth had changed everything, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to face what came next. Damian's confession about Ethan lingered in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged with the promise of chaos. I couldn't shake the image of a little boy out there, a child Damian had turned his back on, a child who shared his blood, but not his life. The revelation had cracked the icy wall I'd built around myself, but it also deepened the chasm between us. I didn't know how to feel. Angry at Damian for his choices, heartbroken for Ethan, or terrified of what Clara's role in all this meant for me. I'd thought I could stay on the sidelines, a reluctant participant in this twisted game. But Clara's return made it clear that I was already in too deep. She came back into our lives like a hurricane, her presence as commanding as it had been at the Gala. I was in the Penthouse's living room, staring out at the city skyline, when the doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that made my stomach twist. Damian was in his study, but I heard his footsteps as he emerged, his expression darkening as he opened the door. Clara stood there, her auburn hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Her crimson lips curled into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't wait for an invitation, brushing past Damian as if she owned the place, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Clara," Damian said, his voice low and edged with warning. "What are you doing here?" She turned to him, her smile widening, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, calculated malice. "I'm here to take back what's mine," she said, her tone as sharp as a blade. Her gaze flicked to me, and I felt the weight of her scrutiny, like a predator sizing up its prey. "And I see your little pet is still here. How quaint." I bristled at her words, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I wasn't a pet, and I wasn't going to let her treat me like one. "I'm not your pawn," I said, echoing the words I'd thrown at her at the Gala, my voice steady despite the fear coiling in my chest. "Whatever you want, it's between you and Damian. Leave me out of it." Clara laughed, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying, like the tinkling of broken glass. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You really think you can stay out of this? You're in the middle of it, whether you like it or not." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you're just a debt to be paid, but you're so much more. You're the perfect way to hurt him." My heart pounded, but I held her gaze, refusing to back down. "I won't let you destroy this family," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I didn't even know why I said it. Damian and I weren't a family, not really. But the thought of Clara using me to hurt him, to hurt Ethan, ignited a fire in me I hadn't known I possessed. Clara's smile faltered for a moment, but then she straightened, her expression hardening. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her voice cold and cutting. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." She turned to Damian, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "I've already spoken to your board, Damian. They're not happy about the rumors. Your little deal with her brother, the mystery woman in your life. They're calling for your resignation. And if that doesn't work, I'll make sure the world knows about Ethan. I'll take him from you, and I'll make sure you pay for it. Literally. I deserve that money, after everything you put me through." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. Clara wasn't just after revenge, she was after money. The kind of money she could get from Damian if she gained custody of Ethan. She'd use the scandal to ruin him, to force his hand, and I was the perfect pawn in her plan. My stomach churned, but I couldn't let her see how much her words shook me. I turned to Damian, searching his face for a reaction, but he was a statue, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. "You won't touch Ethan," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a promise. "I'll fight you with everything I have." Clara smirked, unfazed. "We'll see about that," she said, then turned on her heel and walked out, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. The door closed behind her, but the air in the room felt heavier than ever, charged with the threat of what was to come. I sank onto the couch, my legs trembling, my mind racing. Clara wasn't just a scorned ex. She was a predator, and I was caught in her crosshairs. I pulled out the landline and dialed Mom's number, needing the comfort of her voice, the reminder of why I was here in the first place. "Evelyn, honey, are you okay?" she asked, her tone laced with worry. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing a smile into my voice. "I'm fine, Mom," I lied, then told her everything. Clara, Ethan, the threat to Damian. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then Mom spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You're stronger than you think, Evelyn," she said. "You've always been the one to hold us together. Don't let her break you." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. I hung up, my resolve hardening. I couldn't let Clara win. Not for my sake, not for Damian's, and certainly not for Ethan's. I turned to Damian, who was still standing by the door, his shoulders tense, his gaze distant. "We'll get through this," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. He looked at me, his eyes softening for the first time since I'd met him, and he nodded, his hand reaching out to squeeze mine. "Thank you for staying," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. And in that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice, even if it meant facing a battle I wasn't sure I could win. Clara's threat hung over us like a guillotine, its blade poised to drop at any moment. I'd seen the fire in her eyes, the ruthless determination that promised destruction, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she'd torn Damian apart, and me along with him. But something had shifted inside me after our confrontation. I wasn't just a pawn anymore, a victim of my brother's betrayal. I was a fighter, And I'd be damned if I let Clara destroy the fragile family I was starting to care about, even if it wasn't mine by choice. Damian didn't waste time. The morning after Clara's visit, he called a press conference, his jaw set with a resolve I hadn't seen before. I stood beside him in the Penthouse's living room, watching as he prepared to face the world. He'd traded his usual tailored suit for a simple white shirt and dark slacks, a subtle signal of vulnerability that made my chest ache. "I'm going to tell them about Ethan," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of fear. "I can't let her use him against me. He deserves better than that." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "You're doing the right thing," I said, and I meant it. For the first time since I'd woken up in this penthouse, I saw Damian, not as the man who'd bought me, but as a father desperate to make things right. When the cameras started rolling, he spoke with a raw honesty that silenced the room, admitting to his past mistakes, claiming Ethan as his son, and vowing to be the father the boy deserved. I watched from the sidelines, my heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and sorrow, knowing the cost of his confession. The board would likely force him out. His reputation would take a hit. But he didn't care, not if it meant protecting Ethan. For a brief moment, I thought we'd won. The press conference ended, and Damian turned to me, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice rough with gratitude. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Hope. But that hope shattered when his phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet like a knife. Damian answered, his face paling as he listened. "What do you mean Ethan's gone?" he demanded, his voice rising with panic. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, as he put the call on speaker. It was Clara's voice on the other end, cold and triumphant. "You thought you could outsmart me, Damian?" she said. "I've taken Ethan. If you want him back, you'll give me what I deserve. Everything." The line went dead, and Damian's knees buckled, his hand gripping the edge of the table to keep himself upright. I'd never seen him like this, broken, terrified, a father facing his worst nightmare. "We have to find him," he whispered, his voice trembling. And I nodded, my own fear giving way to a fierce determination. I wasn't going to let Clara win. Not this time. The rain started as we left the penthouse, a torrential downpour that soaked us to the bone as we drove through the city, following the only lead we had. A cryptic message Clara had sent with a location. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Brooklyn. The streets were slick with water, the streetlights casting eerie reflections on the pavement, but I barely noticed. My mind was on Ethan, on the little boy I'd never met, but already felt a fierce need to protect. Damian drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might break. When we reached the warehouse, it loomed before us like a ghost, its rusted walls and broken windows a stark contrast to the glittering world we'd left behind. We moved quickly, the rain masking the sound of our footsteps as we slipped inside. The air was damp and heavy, the darkness broken only by the faint glow of a flickering bulb in the corner. And there, tied to a chair, was Ethan, a small trembling boy with Damian's dark hair and wide, terrified eyes. "Ethan!" Damian's voice cracked as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees in front of his son. He worked frantically to untie the ropes, his hands shaking, and I knelt beside him, my heart breaking at the sight of the boy's tear-streaked face. "It's okay, buddy," Damian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." He pulled Ethan into his arms, holding him tight, and I saw the tears streaming down his face, a father's guilt and love pouring out in a way I'd never thought possible. I reached out, my hand trembling as I wiped the tears from Ethan's cheek. "You're safe now," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Ethan looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and then he whispered, his voice so small it nearly broke me. "Will you be my mom?" The question hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt my own tears spill over, hot against my cheeks. I nodded, unable to speak, and pulled him into a hug, feeling his small arms wrap around me. In that moment, I knew I'd do anything for this boy, for this family I'd never expected to have. Damian's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I looked at him, seeing the gratitude, the relief, the love in his eyes. We'd found Ethan, but the battle wasn't over. Clara was still out there, her threat still looming, but as we stood in that warehouse, rain pouring outside, I felt a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Ethan, for Damian, for the family we were becoming. And no matter what came next, I knew we'd face it together. The rain had stopped by the time we brought Ethan back to the penthouse, but the storm inside me still raged. I couldn't erase the image of him tied to that chair, his small body, trembling, his eyes wide with fear. I'd held him close the entire drive back, his head resting against my shoulder, his tiny hand clutching mine as if I were his lifeline. Damian sat beside us, his face etched with a guilt so raw it was almost palpable. He hadn't spoken since we'd left the warehouse, but I could feel the weight of his emotions, the burden of a father who'd nearly lost everything. Once we were inside, I carried Ethan to the guest room, tucking him into bed with a gentleness I hadn't known I possessed. He was exhausted, his eyelids drooping as I pulled the blankets over him, but he reached for my hand, his voice a whisper. "Don't leave," he said, and my heart clenched, a lump rising in my throat. "I won't," I promised, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead. I sat there until his breathing evened out, the soft rhythm of his sleep a balm to my frayed nerves. When I finally stepped out of the room, I found Damian in the living room, staring out at the city skyline, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who'd been through a war, and in a way, he had. I walked over, my footsteps soft against the marble floor, and stood beside him, the silence between us heavy, but not oppressive. "He's asleep," I said quietly, and Damian nodded, his gaze still fixed on the lights of the Empire State Building in the distance. "I failed him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with self-loathing. "I failed Clara. I failed Ethan, and I dragged you into this mess. I don't deserve any of this, your help, your kindness, any of it." He turned to me then, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and I saw the depth of his pain, the years of regret that had carved lines into his face. I reached out, my hand resting on his arm, the warmth of his skin grounding me. "You made mistakes," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "But you're here now. You fought for him, Damian. That matters." He looked at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. And for the first time, I saw the man beneath the cold exterior, a man who wanted to be better, who wanted to heal. The next morning, Damian made a decision that shocked me. He called his board of directors and resigned as CEO, his voice calm but resolute as he spoke over the phone. "I need to be with my son," he said, and I felt a swell of pride for him, for the father he was choosing to become. When he hung up, he turned to me, a small, tentative smile on his lips. "I want to start over," he said, "for Ethan, for us." I didn't know what us meant, not yet, but I knew I wanted to be part of this new beginning. I called Mom and Emily, asking them to come to the penthouse. They arrived that afternoon, Mom's eyes brimming with tears as she hugged me, her arms a familiar comfort I'd missed more than I could say. "I'm so proud of you, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've always been our rock." Emily, now a bright-eyed teenager, threw her arms around me, her laughter filling the room as she showed me a sketch she'd drawn, a family portrait with me, Mom, her, and now Ethan at the center. That evening, I sat with Ethan on the sigh, living room floor, a box of crayons and a stack of paper between us. I'd always loved drawing as a child, but I'd given it up when Dad died, too consumed with taking care of Mom and Emily to indulge in something so frivolous. Now, as I watched Ethan scribble a picture of a house with a big sun above it, I felt a piece of myself come back to life. "Look, Evelyn," he said, holding up his drawing with a grin. "It's our house." I smiled, my heart swelling, and added a little stick figure of myself to the picture, standing beside him. Later that night, I found Damian in Ethan's room, sitting on the edge of the bed, a children's book in his hands. He was reading to Ethan, his voice soft and steady, the words of the Velveteen Rabbit filling the room with a quiet magic. Ethan was already half asleep, his head resting on Damian's arm, and I stood in the doorway, watching them, a warmth spreading through me that I hadn't felt in years. This was what family looked like, not the cold transactions of the world I'd been thrown into, but these small, tender moments that stitched us together. When Ethan was fully asleep, Damian closed the book and stood, his eyes meeting mine. He walked over, his expression a mix of vulnerability and determination, and then, to my surprise, he dropped to one knee in front of me. "I don't deserve you, Evelyn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've made so many mistakes, hurt so many people, but you've shown me what it means to fight for something real. I want to start over, to be the man you and Ethan deserve. Will you let me try?" Tears welled in my eyes, and I nodded, my voice catching as I whispered, "Yes." He stood, pulling me into his arms, and I let myself melt into his embrace, feeling the weight of the past weeks lift, if only for a moment. We weren't perfect, and the road ahead would be hard. Clara was still out there, her threat still looming, but in that moment, I knew we'd face it together. I'd found a family in the most unexpected place, and for the first time since I'd woken up in this penthouse, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The city lights stretched out before us like a sea of stars, their glow a quiet promise against the darkness of the night. I stood beside Damian at the penthouse window, the same window I'd once pressed my hands against in a desperate bid to escape. Now, as I looked out at the Empire State Building, its spire piercing the sky with a defiant brilliance, I felt something entirely different, a sense of belonging, of peace, that I'd never thought possible in this place. Ethan slept in Damian's arms, his small body curled against his father's chest, his breathing soft and steady. I reached out, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead, and felt a warmth settle deep in my bones. It had been a month since the night we'd rescued Ethan from that warehouse. A month since Damian had knelt before me and asked for a chance to start over. In that time, everything had changed. Clara had disappeared after the kidnapping attempt, her threats silenced by the legal action Damian had taken to ensure Ethan's safety. The board had accepted his resignation, and while the tabloids still buzzed with speculation about our story, their words no longer held the power to hurt us. We'd built something stronger, something real. A family forged not by blood or obligation, but by choice, by love. I turned to Damian, my eyes tracing the lines of his face, softened now by a peace I'd never seen in him before. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "for giving me a family." He looked at me, his gaze warm and unguarded, and smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made my heart skip a beat. "You gave me one. 2. he said, his voice low and sincere. I was lost before you, Evelyn. You showed me what it means to fight for something worth keeping. His words wrapped around me like a blanket, and I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder as we watched the city together. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the betrayal, the fear, the pain, and I realized that every step, every tear, had led us to this moment. I'd come to this penthouse as a prisoner, a pawn in a deal I hadn't chosen, but I was leaving it as something more, a partner, a mother, a woman who'd found her strength in the most unexpected place. The next morning, I made a decision I'd been mulling over for weeks. I sat Damian down at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in my hands, and took a deep breath. I want to go back to school, I said, my voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in my stomach. I gave up my dream of becoming a doctor to take care of Mom and Emily after Dad died, but now I think I'm ready to take it back. Damian's eyes lit up with a pride that made my chest ache. You deserve that, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. You deserve every dream you've ever had. I'll support you, Evelyn, whatever you need. His words were a promise, one I knew he'd keep, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. A year later, I stood in a small art gallery in Brooklyn, surrounded by the people I loved most. Ethan's first art exhibition was a modest affair, but the joy on his face as he showed off his drawings made it feel like the grandest event in the world. Mom and Emily were there, Mom's eyes shining with tears of pride, Emily sketching in the corner with a grin on her face. Damian stood beside me, his arm around my waist, his presence a steady anchor in the whirlwind of the evening. Ethan ran up to us, his cheeks flushed with excitement, a drawing clutched in his hands. Look, Evelyn, he said, holding it up for me to see. It was a picture of our family, Damian, me, Ethan, Mom, and Emily, all standing under a bright yellow sun. It's us, he said, and then he threw his arms around me, his voice muffled against my shoulder. I love you, Mom. The word hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears spring to my eyes as I hugged him back, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. I love you too, Ethan, I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. I looked at Damian over Ethan's shoulder, and he smiled, his eyes glistening with tears of his own. In that moment, I knew we'd found something rare and precious, a happiness that had been hard-won, a happiness that had grown from the ashes of our pain. As the evening drew to a close, I stepped outside the gallery, needing a moment to breathe. The city stretched out before me, its lights twinkling like a promise, and I thought about the girl I'd been when I'd first arrived in this world, the girl who'd been sold, who'd been afraid, who'd felt so alone. That girl was still a part of me, but she'd grown into someone stronger, someone who'd learned that true honor wasn't about money or power, but about fixing what was broken, about protecting the ones you loved. Damian joined me, his hand slipping into mine, and we stood there together, watching the city that had once felt so cold and unyielding. Now, it was a canvas of possibility, a place where we'd built a life together. I'd gone back to school, taking the first steps toward becoming a doctor, and Damian had started a new venture, one that allowed him to be the father Ethan needed. We weren't perfect, but we were whole, and that was more than I'd ever dared to hope for. Under the city lights, with my family by my side, I realized I'd found my place. Not in the glittering world of the elite, but in the quiet, steadfast love of the people who mattered most. And that, I knew, was a happiness worth fighting for. If this tale of love, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family touched your heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd give it a like. It means the world to me to know you've connected with this journey, and if you want to join me for more stories that explore the depths of the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's keep sharing these moments of inspiration together. Thank you for being here.